Hello students and welcome to the lecture. So students, as we know that we are covering the historical background of the Indian Constitution, which is important topic for you can say the various competitive exams, all right? And basically these are the topics which we have scheduled for the discussion under this series, okay? Like we are going to talk about the introduction, then about the company rule, then the crown rule, interim government and the first cabinet of India. Okay, so these are the topics basically we have scheduled for the discussion under the heading of historical background, right? Okay, so basically, out of these topics, we had finished the introduction, and what we were discussing over the company rules 1773 to 1858. All right, so we will continue from where we have left in the previous lecture. All right, you could say that this is the Regulating Act of 1773 and the Amending Act of 1781. After this, now we are going to talk about the Pitt's India Act of 1784. I hope that you have revised the previous, you can say, lecture in the well enough manner before you have come for this lecture. As many times I have told you that is for your own benefit. So if you are doing this on the regular basis, that will be a beneficial for you. If you are not doing this on the regular basis, then might be you face some difficulties while attempting the questions in the examination. All right. So basically, after the 1781, after the 1781, in 1784, there is a Pitt's India Act. Okay. This is the next important act. Okay. And the features of this act are like first, it distinguish between the commercial and the political functions of the company. Like when we talk about the British rule, then we know it was basically established by East India Company, right? After the 1757 and 1764. In 1757, there is a Battle of Plassey in which the Bengal, you can say, lost to the British. The second is the 1764, in which Bengal, Bihar, and Odisha, all these three were lost to the British. All right. Thereafter, what we had discussed, that we had discussed the British government was trying to make the traders into the administrator. All right. So, in the effect of this, basically in the 1784 Pitt's India Act, they divided the companies working into the different segment, commercial and the political function. It means that suppose if the company is performing 10 functions, all right. So how many of them are belong to the commercial category and how many of them belong to the political function? All of these got separated. All right. And basically, it allowed the court of directors to manage the commercial affairs, but created a new body called board of directors to manage the political affairs. Thus, it established a system of double government. Like in the previous lecture, when we were talking about the Regulating Act of 1773. So there was a mention about court of directors. Okay. So basically, these were the representatives of the company and they were responsible to the British government over the commercial, civil, criminal, and the military affairs and the functions, rules, and regulations of the company. Right? So, similar thing or a similar power had been granted to the Court of Directors under the Pitt's India Act of 1784, but there is an another body establishment which is known as Board of Controllers. All right. So, Court of Directors had now got the commercial affairs to manage, and the Board of Controllers basically appointed to manage the political affairs of the company. All right. And basically, if we talk about the composition, then Board of Controllers is a 6 members body. All right. It empowered the Board of Control to supervise and direct all operations of the civil and the military government or revenues of the British possession in India. All right. Like if we talk about the East India Company, then we know that the East India Company was established as a traders, right? But after the 1764, when they had got control over the Indian territories, and when the British government was trying to transform the East India Company into the administration form, they had kept two things separated. Means that the commercial, it means that trading functions will be different in comparison with the civil and the military government, or you can say the revenue of the British possession in India. British possession means Bengal, Bihar, Odisha, Madras, Bombay, those areas which were under the control of the British government, or you can say the British East India Company. How the revenue of these places would be generated, all right, and what should be the civil and the military governance of these areas. All of these things now under the control of Board of Controllers, which is the 6 members body. Got it? Thus, the act was significant for two reasons. What were they? First, the company territories in India were for the first time called the British possession in India. It means that if we talk about the Bengal, Bihar, and Odisha, all of these areas were basically conquered by the East India Company. But these were renamed as a British possession in India. It means that these areas were under the control of the British government, not the British East India Company. All right. So the company territories were basically identified as a British possession in India. So their governance and their administration had been transferred to the British Parliament and not vested with the East India Company. Okay. Second, the British government was given the supreme control over company's affairs and its administration in India. All right. It means that the company now becomes the representative of British policies in India. All right. But however, they were put under the supervision and the control of Board of Directors. Got it? So keep this thing in your mind. After this, after the Pitt's Act, next act was Act of 1786. So what happened during this time? Lord Cornwallis was appointed as a Governor General of Bengal. Okay, the first Governor General was Lord Warren Hastings. Right? He was the first Governor General who was appointed under the Regulating Act of 1784. Sorry, 1773. All right. Similarly, Lord Cornwallis was appointed as a Governor General of Bengal, but he had placed two demands before the British Parliament before he is going to accept this offer. The first, that he should be given power to override the decision of his council in special cases. So what is a council? Basically, we had discussed that the Regulating Act basically created a new post of Governor General of Bengal, right? And similarly, we had discussed that the new body named Governor General Council was introduced, and this is four members body. All right, that is what we had discussed in the previous lecture, right? So this council is basically, you can say, appointed to assist the Governor General in functioning. It means that whatsoever the action the Governor General is required to be taken, this must be sanctioned through the Governor General's Council, right? So What the Cornwallis demanded that he must be given power to override the decision of his council in special case. Like his council wants him to go with plan A, but he wants to go with plan B. As per the legal mandate, he is required to obey the decision of council. Okay. So he said that if I would be given some special powers that through which instead of go with plan A, which is the decision of Governor General Council, I could go with plan B, but in some special cases only. Not in every cases, in special cases. Okay. So that is the first demand. Second, that he must be the commander in chief. Basically, what we had discussed that the civil power granted to the company and its servants, and you could say the rest of the powers, it means civil administration and the military, were under the control of the British government. Okay. But he decided, or you can say he placed a demand that he must be the commander in chief and must got the military powers as well. All right. So to empower his conditions and empowers his demands, basically the Act of 1786 was enacted. All right. So keep this thing in your mind. So basically here is the Charter Act of 1793. Okay. So here we could see the word charter. What is the meaning of this? Charter. Rest of the other acts which we have seen so far, these were not the Charter Acts. But here we are going to talk about the Charter Act. Now, what is the difference between those acts and this act? Okay. So remember that if there is a ordinary act, there is a Charter Act. Ordinary act means that it is non-chartered, and Charter Act means it is chartered act, right? So in the case of ordinary act, basically the parliament or the civil government makes rules and regulations. But in the case of Chartered Act, basically the royals or king or queens passes the orders. So that is a difference between the ordinary act or the Charter Act. When we talk about the ordinary act, so generally the parliament or you can see the civil government makes the rules and regulations. But whenever we talk about the Charter Act, then this act usually formulated after the royal orders or you can say as per the orders of the king or the queens. All right. So that is the thing. So Charter Act is basically formulated through the royal orders. Got it? So the features of this act were as follows. First, it extended the overriding power given to Lord Cornwallis over his councils to all future governor generals and the governors of the presidencies. Okay, like Lord Cornwallis was the first governor general who demanded the power of overriding the council's decision in special cases. Okay, so similar type of power is to be granted to all the future generals who would be appointed after the Lord Cornwallis and the governors of the presidencies as well. So that is the first, you can say, the provision of this act. Second, it gave the governor general more powers and control over the governments of the subordinate presidencies of Bombay and Madras. Like we could say, by the Regulating Act itself, the centralized government was formed. Okay, like we had seen prior to the Regulating Act, Bengal, Bombay, and Madras. These were the three presidencies, and they were independent of each other. But after the Regulating Act of 1773, Bombay and Madras presidencies put under the control of the Bengal presidency, right? So it means the powers had already been granted to the Governor General, okay? But these powers were increased, or you could say that the more powers and controls over the governments of the subordinate presidencies of Bombay and Madras had been granted to the Governor General. Thereafter, extended the trade monopoly of the company in India for another period of 20 years. Okay, so basically, you could say, like when the East India Company formulated. Prior to this, there was a group called Merchant Adventurers, right? That is the first group formulated by the British merchants. Thereafter, we had seen that the East India Company formulated. Okay, so when the East India Company formulated, or you can say formed through the royal orders of Queen Elizabeth I, the company had been granted the monopoly over Indian trade. It means that no one from Britain except the East India Company was allowed to do trade with the India. Okay, so that established the monopoly of East India Company in trading with India. So this monopoly was extended for next 20 years after the passing of Charter Act of 1793. It means that till 1813, because the act was passed in 1793. So if you add 20 years, the answer should be 1813. Okay, so from 1793 to 1813, only the East India Company had a power to do trade with India. All right, except them, no one was allowed to do trading with India. Thereafter, it provided that the commander in chief was not be a member of Governor General's Council unless he was so appointed. Okay, so here again, the military leadership got separated from civilian administration. Okay, keep this thing in your mind. Like the military leadership again got separated from the civil administration. Why? Because the commander in chief, who will be a chief of the military, will not be the part of the Governor General's Council until or unless he was appointed. It laid down that the members of Board of Control and their staffs were henceforth to be paid off the Indian revenues. It means that these six members who were the part of Board of Control and the staffs which were there to assist them, all right, all of them would be paid out through the revenue which would be collected through the Indian territories of Bengal, Bombay, and Madras. All right, so that is all about the Act of 1793. Thereafter, another act was passed after the 20 years of the Charter Act of 1793. It means in the 1830. But that is also the Charter Act. It means that it is also having royal force. All right. The features of this act were as follows. First, it abolished the trade monopoly of company in India. Therefore, the Indian trade was thrown open to all British merchants. However, it continued the monopoly of company over trade in tea and trade with China. So basically what happened, like as I had told you, since the first introduction of the East India Company in India, means in 1600, the British East India Company had got the monopoly in trading with the India and other eastern countries. Okay, and basically that was a very much profitable trade. Okay, so what was happening in Britain, that the rich class of merchants were forcing and pressuring the government that this monopoly must be, you can say, stopped. All right, and the rest of the other merchants which were not the stakeholders of the British East India Company, these were also get the chance to trade with India. All right, so that was the pressure created over the British government, as a result of which in the Charter Act of 1830, because in the Charter Act of 1793 the trade monopoly was extended for up to 20 years. So basically in the Charter Act of 1830 this trade monopoly must be stopped, and that happened also. Like the trade monopoly of the company was abolished, and all the other British merchants, okay, who were not the stakeholders of the East India Company, were also got the permission to do trade with India. All right, but the British East India Company still had got one monopoly, and that was trading and trade, tea trade or normal trade with China. It means that no other British merchant or the British company were allowed to do trade with China in terms of tea or trading. Only the British East India Company had the right to do this. Thereafter, it asserted the sovereignty of British Crown over the company's territory in India. Okay, like the British Crown would be now the supervisor of company's territory and the activities in India. But remember, just a just a supervisory role had been acquired by them. Okay, not the absolute control. Okay, that is the main thing. Like no absolute control was transferred to the British Crown. Only the supervisory role, or you can say over the supervisory power, had been taken over by the British Crown. Thereafter, it allowed the Christian missionaries to come to India for the purpose of enlightening the people. Like we know, in Europe, the Christian, or you can say Christianity, is the major religion, right? So when they had established their rooted, and you can say when they had established their rule in India, so basically by the Charter Act of 1830, Christian missionaries got the permission to come to India, okay, and enlightening the people. It means that preaching and ensure their conversion into the Christianity. All right. So these permission were granted to them. Thereafter, it provided for the spread of Western education amongst the inhabitants of the British territories in India. It means that the areas which the Britishers had occupied so far, it means that Bengal Presidency, Bombay Presidency, and Madras Presidency. So all the inhabitants who were living in these British territories, okay, so they were now supposed to attend the Western education. All right. It authorized the local governments in India to impose taxes on persons. They could also punish the persons for not paying taxes. It means that in the first act, basically, they centralize the powers, right? But in the Charter Act of 1813, centralize the powers in the Regulating Act. But in the Chartered Act of 1830, basically they decentralize the powers. Okay, it means that the relaxation had been granted to the people. Okay, so that is the thing. All right. So, students, basically in this lecture we have covered till here. In the next lecture, we will continue from here. Till then, I want you all to revise all the facts and figures which we have discussed in this lecture. Okay, so that you would be mentally prepared for the things which we will cover in the next lecture. Because all the things, and you can say all the events, are interconnected to each other. So if you are not covering the previous things, you won't be able to grasp the new things. All right. So with this note, we are going to end this lecture. All right. So thank you.